Hey, so as said, I'm Scott Crouch. I'm with USAA. I am a technical architect. And as someone pointed out to me during the meet and greet earlier, the question was, well, you're an architect. Are you the architect who does stuff, or you just talk about things? It was a very self-reflective moment for me, but I like to think I'm both. And there's a clicker here somewhere.
Does Eric still have it?
And they stole it from me. So so to get started though, today we're going to talk about our continuous delivery journey. And it's been going on for 15 years in many different phases. We didn't used to call it continuous delivery, right? So I mean, everybody's been doing automation, those types of things. And we've been doing those things. So what we want to talk to you about is kind of our phases, what we've done, what we've learned, and how we progressed. But before we get into that, I want to explain, who of y'all have heard of USAA? Like, raise your hands. Good. Great. Then I don't have to sit here and explain USAA's financial services company. We target the military community. Great member experience. That's what we're known for. But it's a good company to work for too. So we're excited about that. So again, as I talked about, like, we're going to do a history, and to the question about how do you get executive buy-in, sometimes we've had to explain our history on executive buy-in. Like, why do we have to do something new now? Well, let's look about how we got to where we're at, right? And so I'm going to go through a little bit of that. And then I want to introduce the concept of our Talon Development Platform. And that's our new thing. That's our new way of having a full development stack that is completely different than our old stack. And then I'm going to go through a couple of key decisions that were made in my space, even though there's a lot of spaces that were involved in the Talon platform. I'm going to go through a few of those and talk to you about kind of why we made those decisions, and then lessons learned, what was good, what was bad. So this is an eye chart. You're not supposed to read everything on here, right? But what we started talking about is for 15 years, we've been doing development. We've been doing continuous delivery automation. And if you go back to 2001, we were just starting on Java, and a lot of the tools available today, like the common ones, like Maven, right, like wasn't an option, right? So we were figuring out how to automate our builds because we knew we weren't going to go touch our production environment, by hand and copying jar files out there. So we figured out automation, and we did this work. And when we started thinking about, like, we drew this nebulous, subjective, amount towards continuous delivery nirvana, right, as the y-axis there. And we started talking about, were we getting better? And what we realized over time is we would do a lot of work, and we would make things slightly better, but we weren't really keeping up with what the industry trends were, right? We were doing our own thing. And so while we were doing, and we still do today on our classic development, that yellow line there is our classic development environment, we still do weekly releases there that are fully automated. We have thousands of changes across thousands of applications contributed to via thousands of developers, and those are fully automated. And that includes PCI environments and all of the things that you need for an automated world. And that's exciting, but we realized we weren't ever going to, with all of the dependencies, all the one-offs, all the snowflakes that we had created in that world, we had created this hodgepodge of things that worked well, but we could never relate to anybody else's, right? So when we'd talk to a cool new vendor who had a security tool that you could plug into your pipeline, they'd look at our stuff and be like, yeah, we don't know how we're going to do that, right? Like, y'all's is so weird, we're not going to be able to, that's just going to be a one-off special. We could build it for you, services, right? So what we wanted to do was really rethink and start from scratch. Starting from scratch for a big company is a big deal, right? When we talk about we have a platform for 1,000 developers or thousands of developers, we want to build a new one. Well, fortunately, we got lucky. Right about the time we were having real heartfelt thoughts about this thing for us came along called New Web. And New Web for us is just basically our thing that we called our React front-end development, right? And we decided we're going to re-platform our front-end development. We said at that point, never put New Web on a slide at a conference because nobody's going to have any idea what we're talking about. Clearly, y'all don't either. It's just React. It's just for front-end development. Funny anecdote. We actually had discovered that a manager had submitted a job rec for 5 years experience on New Web development. And this legit happened, and we're like, no one's going to have 5 years experience on new web development. But When that came along, we had to have the conversation about how we're going to do our deploy automation, how we're going to do continuous delivery. And fortunately, we were able to, with that particular moment, decide, you know what, let's go greenfield, right? And that's where that new red line comes along, right? And we decided we're going to go all out, everything we've ever wanted to do, and just not take all that baggage with us, right? The typical perspective in the past was, we have stuff that works, just make it, tweak it a little bit more, right? And that was a big shifting moment for us. Obviously, that was successful, more successful than we expected. When we started seeing developers using the new web development process, which is just source code, it's an automated deploy, et cetera, they started using it, and the feedback was, for the first teams, we're developing code so much faster now that the business can't keep up with giving us requirements to do, and we're having to come up with things to do now. That was a crazy story for us, right? Before, we had a kind of a tense at times relationship with our business partners about we need this functionality quicker and better, whatever. And that's really started to shift that picture, which gave us that springboard for that executive conversation for the next step, right? Let's re-platform our Java development world, right? That's the big, massive beast of a take that. We still decided we weren't going to just have everything and just copy the paste the code into the new system. Obviously, if we did that, we would bring all the same problems. So we decided we're going to have two platforms. We're going to have the existing classic development platform, and then we're going to have this new thing, which went through a few name changes, called the API platform, and is now the Talon platform, right? And I'll talk a little bit why it's now called the Talon platform. So, what is the Talon platform? This is basically the product speech on what it is. If you want to, another thing about this was we actually did a product management approach for delivering our internal platform. And if you want to talk to Nitu about it, she's our product manager extraordinaire for this. But fundamentally, there was a few key things that we wanted to focus on. Release when ready was actually an interesting conversation. We believed we wanted to empower developers to be able to release faster. We didn't think that meant developers just do whatever they want, right? That's not what we intended. Interestingly enough, developers who are using our systems felt like they were releasing when ready. Like, we still have checks and automations and gates, and there's lots and lots of controls. But because the process was visible to them, they knew what was going on, and it was independent for their application, the last thing there, the self-contained applications, they were moving at the pace of what they wanted to do, which was compared to our classic world where we had scheduled releases, like 18 months, like no joke, 18 months prior to that year, we're making decisions about what the release calendar for the year is going to be. So don't have releases on Mother's Day, don't have releases over spring break, and there's all sorts of rules and processes around the classic release calendar. Well, this puts it into, you can release it what's appropriate for your application, right? We have some teams who don't want to release on a high volume day for the stock market, right? That would make sense for that particular application, but it shouldn't affect a life insurance application, right? So it became this independent releasable concept. The other big goal was the industry standard tools. We want to make sure that we were using tools that a college hire was familiar with, or that someone experienced at another company was familiar with. That was a big empowering thing for our developers. So what does that look like? Here's the stripped out slide that doesn't have any logos on it. Thanks, legal, we've stripped out all the logos. So our high-level platform is basically the Talon platform is a Dockerized application environment, right? Targeting APIs, that's our primary target. It happens to use JBoss as the runtime environment primarily. We're doing it on Kubernetes. And the cool thing about that is because it's Dockerized, because it's Kubernetes, we've really taken a focus on building a pipeline, a paved road for deploying to this environment. And obviously, we had the previous talk was about PCI. That's all relevant here. Like, we had to have all those things. And so we've got all sorts of tools, but what I want to talk about is this right-hand side, not the testing part, but just our source code, build, dependency, continuous delivery ideas, because there's some cool things that happen there. All right, so when I talk about decisions, I'm an architect. I draw things on whiteboards. I talk about things. But really, fundamentally, we eventually make technical decisions. When we do that, the most important things to me are context and then the consequences. Context is important, and I don't like to undersell this. There's a link at the bottom that talks about it. Because context is different based on when you're talking about it. When we go document a decision from 3 years ago, the context was different than it was at this point, right? So things change. So we try to make a good point of really keeping track of that, right? And so we've gotten pretty good about documenting our architectural decisions. We have a formal process for big decisions, but even on the lightweight decisions, which is what that link at the bottom is about, we try to capture all of those lightweight decisions in quick, iterative fashion. So I'm going to go through a couple of decisions that were made. For the Talon platform as a whole, though, we had some context that was relevant. Some of our goals included a Greenfield approach, right? We said, let's minimize to all extent possible interactions with the classic environment. Like the only interaction should be through an API to the classic environment. We don't carry over any of our existing homegrown ways to resolve dependencies for Java, right? Like we built our own dependency resolution, we had our own branching strategies and all of that, right? Throw that out, it's Greenfield. It stays there, we're not getting rid of it. Like there's no like go retire classic, right? That will stay there, but the new path exists as its separate thing. We wanted to make sure that we focused on developer experience and empowerment. Fundamentally, we saw a pattern of there is at least 20% of our developers, which is hundreds of developers, who are passionate about ideas, right? They tried something somewhere, they want to go try this new tool, and those ideas frequently turn into very, very valuable things, right? In our existing world where it's centrally controlled, it's centrally managed, if you want to request a change to the build system, you basically submit a work request and wait 6 months for them to reject it, right? And I'm exaggerating a little bit, right? But what we wanted to do was make sure that we could empower them. The semantic version, explicit dependencies, I alluded to that, but it brings up an interesting point. We had decided at some point, because in our classic world, we have big, massive WebSphere cells, right? J2E app server environments with 1,500 ears running on a cell. And on there, we shared jars across there, right? And so we said, hey, there is one common infrastructure jar, 1,500 apps are using it, and we can make a decision like, we'll update it for everybody, and now everybody gets that change. That's cool, right? Because we can roll things out fast, but that means you have to, the potential scope of every single change is 1,500 applications. And so that decision for us of changing away from this kind of floating dependency idea to this explicitly defined dependencies was a big shift. And so it's not as relevant probably to most of you guys, but fundamentals of semantic versioning and adopting Gradle and Maven concepts is important. All right. One of the big decisions that started off with our new web space was we brought in GitLab. Now, the question of why did we bring in GitLab is an important one. We had source control tools, right? But we knew all of our developers saying, I use Git. And so we thought maybe it's just the vocal person, right? We knew that in the industry, GitLab, or Git was a very popular one. But we decided to test this theory, right? And so we did, for like 6 months, we did an internal poll for all external hires, whether they were experienced or college hires. We did a poll. What source control tools are you using, right? What have you experienced with? And it was pretty much all Git. And that was not surprising, right? But what really surprised us was GitLab was really common, right? And so we started, okay, let's look into that a little bit more, right? It happened to align really well with our goal of, at that point in time, we needed a on-premise hosted source control tool for various reasons, whatever, that's shifted. That was our requirement, right? It had to be an on-premise tool. And we also didn't want to spend a lot of time administering it, because at that point, honestly, we were bringing in a tool for the new web stuff that we weren't quite sure we were going to get convinced and buy off that we're going to go down this path of doing it differently, like we're going to have to stick it into the old world at some point. Maybe, right? So let's make it really easy to administer. That played out actually really well, considering we have we are doing at least every month upgrades of GitLab, and we spend probably about 15 minutes a week or on the weekend doing that upgrade. The administrators love it. It's super easy for them, and that's worked out really well. So we've met all of those goals. But the side effect was we wanted to start talking about GitLab CI. We didn't know at the time we were talking about GitLab CI. We just knew we needed a continuous integration tool. And we didn't want to do, because we were building Dockerized applications and we were going to put them in Kubernetes, we knew we wanted to have a full pipeline tool that automated the delivery all the way to production, right? We know we could easily use something to just publish to an artifact repository or whatever, but we wanted the gating and the quality checks to be built in. And the most important thing is we wanted to not have the structure of that delivery process to be centrally controlled. We wanted to have a default approach, and we wanted to be able to make it so that a developer can make the decision about what should happen. And the best way we found was all the continuous integration tools that define the pipeline in your code base. Because if it's defined in your code base, fundamentally, we can't centrally control it, right? There's no build team that can say this is the way it's going to be done. So that was cool. But at the same time, we have to know, obviously, audit is important, right? So we did build in a couple little controls. And that's where we did things like in GitLab CI, every build job for us happens inside of a Docker container. So things like a promote to the production artifact registry only occurs through our image because we're the only ones with the credential to it. And we can put checks into that so that we can say, hey, if you haven't received this sign off, you can't promote it. If you haven't done this, you can't promote it. And that allowed us to leave those checks and leave those controls. But the rest of, I want to plug in a new testing tool, I want to plug in this other validation step, I can do that all I want. I don't have to ask anybody. We also realized, though, it's great that you can do whatever you want. It's good, but there's 80% of those developers who don't want to, right? They just want it to work, right? I want to check in my code, it builds and it deploys. And things were going really well there, but we wanted to create a paved road, right? And that's what Netflix uses the words paved road. We really knew that that's what we wanted. So we actually took a tool called startspring.io. You have Spring developers, you've heard of that, you've been there, right? And we forked it, right? Amusingly enough, we forked this and we added all of our own pipelines. I was actually talking with one of the original developers of Spring, and he said he's sort of shocked at the number of times he's heard this story, that big companies just forking start.spring.io. So it's kind of, at least that was validating. We thought we were a little crazy, but apparently we weren't. And between that, where we have a skeleton code base, and then we created another tool that basically instantiates your namespaces in OpenShift, in Artifact Registry, instantiates your namespace in GitLab, hooks up all the security accounts. We don't have our pipelines, like your pipeline account that you used actually is pulled from CyberArk, so the development team doesn't know their actual pipeline configurations or credentials. So we set up a tool to configure all of that. Between those two, we have actually been able to prove that 0 to hello world state, we can actually do in hours instead of in our past world was weeks, right? Like in the sense of it used to take weeks to start a new application. And we challenged ourselves a little bit. We said we're not only going to do 0 to hello world in hours, we're going to do it with our executives. So we took our executives, we sat them down in a lab, gave them a laptop with nothing on it, said here's some instructions, you're going to deliver an application to prod. It was a hello world application, right? But we actually had executives who didn't do development on a regular basis with a blank machine go from nothing to a production delivered application on our real production environment with approvals and everything, right? They got their sign-offs. And that was a very telling story for us. The argument being, if they can do it on a Hello World app, then a developer can do the same thing on some real hard code. So we believed we achieved all these things. We wanted to validate that though, right? Because it's important to just not say, hey, we checked the box on a slide deck, so therefore it's good. User feedback has been great. So we talked to developers, what do you like, whatever, right? And this is where I'm going to turn it over to Neetu at some point, right? So if you want to talk to her about the details, customers are loving the Talon platform. So what are our lessons learned? For us, not being afraid of Greenfield was important. We spent probably years hemming and hawing over, can we just make our existing world better, right? Why can't we just add on this feature? Why can't we just replace, why don't we just place our source code management tool and then everybody will be happy, right? Why can't you just plug things in, right? At some point, you got to realize you have a much larger problem than individual, tools or processes or anything like that. And the advantage of having both the old and the new and not a forced migration is then it becomes, as a developer, I really own my movement to that new platform and I'm really responsible for it. Similarly, we wanted to make sure that the right thing to do was the easy thing to do. That gets back to, like I said, you don't have the credentials to to deploy your application. We wanted to make that easy, so nobody tried to figure out a better way to do it, right? Or a different way, let's say. And all of those types of issues, like just make it easy to get going, and then you don't have to worry about hunting down the people who are doing something crazy. They're going to choose the easy way, right? Planning for change was an important one for us. We've already seen, we've had this new approach in production for 12 months, something like that, 6 months? 6 months. And we already know that there's things that we want to swap out and change about it. We know that, like our build environment is running on a separate set of runners. We actually want to run those runners on our Kubernetes environment and just reclaim some space of servers, right? Because we've got 40-something nodes in our runner environment. But we know things like that require swapping out the Docker build tool, right? So you don't have to run Docker inside of a container on your production Kubernetes environment, which is a very insecure activity, right? So we've got the hook points where we know how we'll swap in a different CI image that has the new build tools in it. And we've planned for that modularity of the pipeline so we can just swap things out as we go. And then last, we know that we have many communities involved, both from our partner vendors with GitLab, who allows us to see what they're doing and help submit merge requests or all of those things. But we also know we have an internal community of developers, right? Our internal developers love that the entire platform is open. It's just code that they can submit merge requests to. And they actually move us forward constantly at a rate that we couldn't do with just a handful of developers on the platform side. So that's exciting. So as a whole, I'd say the process has been good. I would love to hear these types of conversations in these conferences, what things y'all are experiencing. And what is exciting to me is what I've seen in recent conferences. We can actually converse about the same problem space because we're using some of the same approaches, the same tools, right? Which is in contrast to conferences I've been to 5, 10 years ago, where we'd be talking and y'all be like, that doesn't make any sense. Why would y'all do that, right? So hit me up, let me know, and we'll have more conversations. I don't know if we have time for questions, but.